Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's peaceful journey, we'll step into another world, familiar in its humanity, yet distant in time. Perhaps you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or maybe you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way here, I'm grateful. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. The idea of this quiet story floating across the world always makes me smile. In this gentle tale, I'll reveal the hidden daily routines of the ancient people of Kemet, the land we now call Egypt, across every social class, from the humblest farmer to the wealthiest merchant. We'll explore what they ate for breakfast, how they handled their most private moments, what their work schedules looked like, and even how they entertained themselves when the sun went down. But first, let me give you a glimpse of just how detailed this reconstruction becomes. We know exactly what time most people of Kemet woke up, what they used instead of toothbrushes, and even how they dealt with workplace disputes that would make your office politics look like child's play. So, let's start our day as an ancient person of Kemet would have right at sunrise along the life-giving waters of the great river. Picture this. It's approximately 3,000 years before our common era, and the first rays of sunlight are creeping across the eastern horizon. For most ancient people of Kemet, this wasn't just the beginning of a new day. It was literally the daily rebirth of the sun god Rhea, and missing this moment wasn't really an option. Unlike our modern world, where we fight alarm clocks and hit snooze buttons, the people of ancient Kemet were naturally synchronized with the solar cycle in ways that would seem almost supernatural to us today. The average family lived in a mud brick house that was specifically designed to work with the desert climate. These weren't the massive stone monuments we see in documentaries. We're talking about practical, efficient homes with flat roofs that served as extra living space, thick walls that kept the interior cool during scorching days, and small windows positioned to catch the breeze while keeping out the worst of the sandstorms. As dawn broke, the first person stirring in most households was typically Nefert, the woman of the house. Now, before you start thinking this was because of some oppressive system, the reality was far more practical. Women of Kemet often controlled the household finances, ran businesses, and held significant social power. The early rising was simply because someone had to get the bread started. And in ancient Kemet, fresh bread wasn't just breakfast. It was literally the foundation of every single meal. But here's where it becomes fascinating. The process of making this daily bread reveals so much about how these people lived. First, they had to grind grain using stone querns, which was backbreaking work that could take hours. The grain itself came from emmer wheat or barley, and the quality of your bread directly reflected your social status. Wealthy families like that of Kamwaset, a prosperous merchant, had servants to do this grinding, while poorer families like that of Seneb, a humble farmer, often had to wake up even earlier to get it done before the heat became unbearable. While the bread was being prepared, other family members were handling what we might call their morning routine, though it looked nothing like ours. The people of ancient Kemet were actually incredibly concerned with cleanliness and personal hygiene, but they didn't have running water or modern plumbing. Instead, they used a system that was both ingenious and labor-intensive. Every morning, family members would wash using water stored in large pottery jars. This water had to be carried from the great river or from local wells, and it was precious enough that every drop was used efficiently. They cleaned their teeth using frayed twigs, often from the persea tree, which actually has natural antibacterial properties. Some wealthier people like Amenhotep, a royal scribe, even had a kind of tooth-cleaning paste made from ground pumice, salt, and mint. But perhaps most surprisingly, both men and women wore makeup every single day. And this wasn't just about vanity. The famous black coal eyeliner that we associate with ancient Kemet served multiple practical purposes. It helped protect their eyes from the harsh desert sun. It had antibacterial properties that prevented eye infections, and it was believed to provide spiritual protection from evil forces. The application of this makeup was actually a complex ritual that tells us a lot about their values. They used mirrors made from polished bronze or silver, and the wealthy had elaborate cosmetic sets with multiple containers for different substances. The kohl was made from ground galena or malachite mixed with animal fat or oil and applied with small sticks or brushes. Both men and women outlined their eyes dramatically, often extending the lines beyond the natural eye shape in styles that varied by region and time period. Young Izit, daughter of the potter Tehotep, would spend careful minutes each morning learning this art from her mother, and Kissaman. Once the morning preparations were complete, it was time for the first meal of the day. And this is where we start to see the massive differences between social classes that defined every aspect of life in Kemet. For a wealthy family like that of Rameses, a high-ranking official, breakfast might include fresh bread, honey, figs, dates, cheese made from goat or cow milk, and even meat left over from the previous day. They might drink beer, which was actually safer than water and was consumed by people of all ages, including children. This beer was thick, nutritious, and had a relatively low alcohol content, making it more like a liquid bread than the beer we know today. But for a typical farming family like that of Keti and his wife, Merit, breakfast was far simpler. Coarse bread, perhaps some onions or garlic, and weak beer or water flavored with herbs. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and fresh fruits were seasonal treats rather than daily staples. However, regardless of social class, every family faced the same challenge as the day progressed: the relentless heat of the desert sun. This shaped everything about how they structured their daily activities, and it created work patterns that were completely different from anything we experience in our modern climate-controlled world. Most outdoor work had to be completed in the early morning hours, roughly from sunrise until about the 10th hour. As the temperature climbed, people would retreat to the coolest parts of their homes or find shade wherever possible. This wasn't laziness. It was survival. Working in the full heat of a midday sun could literally be fatal, and everyone understood this fundamental truth. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of daily life in Kemet: their work. And contrary to popular belief, most people weren't building pyramids. The pyramid building period was actually relatively short in their long history, and even during that time, the majority of the population was engaged in agriculture, crafts, trade, or various service industries that kept this complex civilization running. Let's start with the farmers, who made up about 80% of the population. Their daily routine was entirely dictated by the annual flood cycle of the Great River, which was so central to life that their calendar was built around it. The year was divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, the flooding season; Pare, the growing season; and Shamu, the harvest season. During Akhet, when the river flooded and covered the farmland with fertile silt, farmers couldn't work their fields. But this didn't mean they were idle. Many were recruited for public works projects, including the construction of monuments, temples, and yes, sometimes pyramids. Others worked on maintaining irrigation systems, preparing tools for the next planting season, or engaging in crafts that could be traded once the floods receded. Jehuti, a skilled farmer from a village near Memphis, would spend flood season helping to repair the local temple walls. His strong hands that knew soil and seed, now learning to work with stone and mortar. His son Horus, barely 14, would sit beside him, absorbing not just the techniques, but the songs and stories that made the work bearable. When Pare arrived and the waters receded, farmers faced an incredibly intense period of activity. They had to plow the mud-softened fields using wooden plows pulled by oxen, plant their crops, and then begin the constant battle against pests, weeds, and the ever-present threat of drought or unexpected flooding. But here's what makes farming in Kemet so different from what you might expect. These weren't individual family farms in the way we might imagine. Most farmland was owned by the pharaoh, temples, or wealthy nobles like Amenemheb, a provincial governor. The actual farmers were more like tenant workers or sharecroppers, owing a significant portion of their harvest to their landlords and to the state in the form of taxes. The daily life of a farmer during planting season started before dawn. After their simple breakfast, they would head to the fields carrying wooden hoes, sickles, and baskets. The work was back-breaking, breaking up clods of earth, removing stones, planting seeds by hand, and constantly maintaining the complex network of irrigation channels that brought river water to their crops. Women often worked alongside men in the fields, especially during harvest time, but they also had specialized roles. Many were responsible for winnowing grain, separating the wheat from the chaff using large baskets and the desert wind. Others managed the storage of harvested crops, which required extensive knowledge of how to protect grain from insects, rodents, and moisture. Had, wife of the farmer Nebaman, had developed such skill in grain storage that neighboring villages would seek her advice. Her weathered hands could detect the slightest hint of dampness that might lead to spoilage, and her knowledge of which herbs repelled insects was legendary in her district. Children weren't exempt from this work either. As soon as they were old enough, usually around age 5 or 6, they began helping with simple tasks like scaring birds away from crops or carrying water. By their early teens, they were expected to contribute significantly to the family's labor. Young Num, son of the farmer Userhat, would rise with the adults, his small hands surprisingly adept at selecting the best seeds for planting. His quick eyes could spot the flash of ibis wings that meant the birds were coming for the grain, and his voice, still high and clear, could carry the warning calls across the fields. But farming was just one piece of the incredibly complex economic system that made ancient Kemet function. In the towns and cities along the Great River, a completely different kind of daily life was unfolding, one that involved craftsmen, merchants, scribes, and service workers whose routines were shaped by different pressures and opportunities. Take, for example, the daily life of Heti, a carpenter in ancient Thebes. His morning would begin much like the farmer's, with simple food and the application of protective coal. But instead of heading to fields, he would walk to his workshop carrying tools that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Craftsmen of Kemet used copper and bronze chisels, saws, adzes, and measuring tools that allowed them to create furniture, boats, coffins, and architectural elements with precision that still amazes modern craftsmen. Their daily work involved not just the physical labor of cutting and shaping wood, but also the complex logistics of obtaining materials in a desert environment where good timber was often imported from Lebanon or Nubia. Social dynamics of these workshops were fascinating. Master craftsmen like Userhat supervised apprentices in a system that was part education, part labor arrangement. Young boys would be bound to masters for years, learning not just the technical skills of the craft, but also the business relationships, quality standards, and artistic traditions that would allow them to eventually establish their own workshops. Amenhotep, a boy of 12, had been apprenticed to the master carpenter Senamut for 2 years now. His days began before dawn, preparing the workshop, arranging tools, and mixing the resins and oils that would be needed for the day's work. But gradually, Senmut was allowing him to try his hand at simpler pieces, first just sanding, then measuring, and recently, he had been permitted to make his first careful cuts on a piece of imported cedar. But here's what's really interesting about craftsmanship. In Kemet, it wasn't just about creating functional objects. Every piece was expected to meet both practical and spiritual requirements. Heti, making a chair, wasn't just concerned with whether someone could sit on it comfortably. He also had to ensure that the proportions, decorations, and even the wood selection aligned with their beliefs about harmony, protection, and the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. This spiritual dimension affected every aspect of daily work life in ways that might seem strange to modern people. Before beginning any significant project, craftsmen would often make offerings to Ptah, the god of craftsmanship, or to other deities associated with their particular trade. The workshop itself might contain small shrines where workers could pray for protection from accidents or for inspiration in their work. Senenmut's workshop had a small alcove where a statue of Ptah sat surrounded by offerings of bread and beer. And each morning, the workers would pause in their preparations to ask for the god's blessing on their endeavors. The working day for most craftsmen followed a pattern similar to the farmers. Intense activity in the cooler morning hours, a long break during the heat of midday, and then a return to work in the late afternoon and early evening. But unlike farmers, whose work was seasonal, craftsmen had to maintain steady production throughout the year to meet the constant demand for their goods. This brings us to one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of ancient life in Kemet, the incredible complexity of their economy and the role of trade in shaping individual routines. Kemet wasn't an isolated civilization living in splendid isolation along the great river. It was actually the hub of an incredibly sophisticated trade network that stretched from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean and from the Red Sea to the western oases of the Sahara. This meant that the daily lives of countless people were shaped by this constant flow of goods, people, and ideas through their communities. Consider the life of Hamiunu, a merchant in ancient Memphis, one of the great commercial centers. His day would begin not just with the usual morning routine, but with a careful review of inventory, price calculations, and planning for the complex negotiations that lay ahead. Unlike modern commerce, where prices are fixed and transactions are standardized, ancient trade in Kemet was a highly personal, relationship-based system where every deal required extensive bargaining and social maneuvering. Aminunu might be dealing with Nubian gold traders like Adam bringing precious metals from the south, Lebanese cedar merchants like Yabnet offering the high-quality timber that Kemet desperately needed, or local farmers like Kamtar bringing surplus grain to exchange for manufactured goods. Each transaction required not just business acumen, but also cultural sensitivity, language skills, and a deep understanding of the religious and social customs that govern different communities. But here's what makes commerce in Kemet so fascinating. They didn't use money in the way we understand it. Instead, they operated on a complex barter system supplemented by standardized units of value based on weights of copper, silver, or grain. Amunu's daily life involved constant mathematical calculations, converting the value of different goods into these standard units, and negotiating exchanges that satisfied all parties involved. The record-keeping alone was a massive undertaking. Merchants like Hemiunu employed scribes to document every transaction, creating detailed papyrus records that had to account for quantities, qualities, dates, and the identities of all parties involved. These weren't just business records. They were legal documents that could be used to resolve disputes or collect debts, sometimes years after the original transaction. Kamwasat, one of Heminu's trusted scribes, would spend hours each day updating the merchant's records, his reed pen moving carefully across the papyrus as he recorded not just the basic facts of each trade, but also notes about the reliability of trading partners, seasonal variations in supply and demand, and observations about market conditions that might affect future business decisions. Chapter 6. The Scribes. Sacred Duty. And speaking of scribes, let's dive into the daily life of perhaps the most envied profession in ancient Kemet. Becoming a scribe was one of the few ways for someone from a modest background to achieve real social mobility and the training required was both grueling and transformative. A young scribes, they began with hours of practice copying hieroglyphic texts, learning not just the symbols themselves, but also the proper techniques for preparing papyrus, mixing inks, and maintaining the reed pens that were essential tools of the trade. This wasn't just penmanship practice. It was an intensive education in literature, mathematics, law, religion, and administration that could take a decade or more to complete. Amenemop, a student at the temple school in Thebes, would rise before dawn to begin his copying exercises, his fingers cramped from holding the reed pen, his eyes strained from working by lamplight. But gradually, under the patient guidance of his teacher Amenhotep, he was learning not just to copy the sacred texts, but to understand their meaning, to appreciate the rhythm and beauty of the ancient poetry, and to grasp the complex legal and administrative concepts that governed life in Kemet. Master scribes worked in a variety of settings that shaped their daily routines in different ways. Some were attached to temples, spending their days recording religious ceremonies, managing temple finances, and copying sacred texts. Others worked for government administrators, documenting tax collections, legal proceedings, and official correspondence. The most elite scribes served in the royal court, where their daily responsibilities might include drafting diplomatic letters, recording the pharaoh's decrees, or maintaining the complex genealogical and ceremonial records that legitimized royal authority. Amenemhab, chief scribe to the provincial governor, would spend his mornings taking dictation, his afternoons reviewing legal documents, and his evenings teaching younger scribes the intricacies of administrative procedure. His was a life of constant mental activity, requiring not just technical skill, but also discretion, judgment, and the ability to navigate complex political relationships. But regardless of their specific role, all scribes shared certain daily challenges that were unique to their profession. They had to maintain their materials in perfect condition despite the harsh desert environment, protect their papyrus from insects and moisture, and ensure that their writing met the exacting standards expected in a culture where written records were considered to have magical as well as practical. Power. Chapter 7. The Women's Domain. The social dynamics of a scribe's daily life were particularly complex because they operated at the intersection of different social classes. A scribe might spend his morning taking dictation from a wealthy noble like Reckmeyer, his afternoon mediating a dispute between merchants, and his evening teaching basic writing skills to the children of craftsmen who could afford private tutoring. This brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient society in Kemet, the role of women in daily economic life. Unlike many ancient civilizations, Kemet offered women substantial opportunities for economic independence and social influence. Though these opportunities varied significantly based on social, class, and family circumstances, wealthy women could own property, run businesses, and engage in legal transactions with a freedom that wouldn't be seen in many other societies for thousands of years. A typical day for Nefertiti, a prosperous merchant woman, might involve supervising textile production in her workshops, negotiating contracts with suppliers, managing a staff of servants and workers, and maintaining the social relationships that were essential for business success. These women didn't just inherit their positions. Many built their wealth through their own entrepreneurial efforts. Some specialized in luxury goods like perfumes, jewelry, or fine textiles. Others operated taverns, managed agricultural estates, or ran the complex household operations that supported wealthy families. Hatshepsut, who had started with a small weaving operation in her home, had gradually built a business that employed dozens of women throughout Memphis. Her daily routine involved checking on the quality of different productions, negotiating with suppliers for raw materials, and maintaining relationships with customers who valued her reputation for exceptional work. Their daily routines required the same skills as their male counterparts, mathematical ability, negotiation skills, cultural awareness, and the physical stamina to manage multiple responsibilities throughout long, demanding days. But even women from more modest backgrounds had opportunities that might surprise modern observers. Many worked as professional mourners, entertainers, or religious functionaries. Others operated small businesses from their homes, producing bread, beer, textiles, or other goods that they sold in local markets. The daily life of Tarut, a working woman in ancient Kemet, was shaped by the same environmental challenges that affected everyone else, but with the additional complexity of managing family responsibilities alongside economic activities. Running a small bakery from her home, she would have to coordinate her bread production with childcare, ensure that her ovens were properly maintained despite the scarcity of fuel, manage relationships with grain suppliers and customers, and maintain the quality standards that could make or break her reputation in the local community. Her daughter Isis, now 10 years old, had become an essential part of the operation. Her small hands perfect for shaping the smaller loaves. Her keen eyes good at spotting when the bread was perfectly baked. Together, they had developed a rhythm that allowed them to produce enough bread not just for their own family, but for several neighbors who preferred Tarut's baking to their own efforts. Chapter 8. The River Servants Now. All of these economic activities were supported by an infrastructure that required its own army of workers whose daily lives were essential but often overlooked. The people who maintained irrigation systems, transported goods along the great river, operated the docks and warehouses, and provided the countless services that kept this complex society functioning. Take the daily life of Kempter, a riverboatman whose work was absolutely crucial for civilization in Kemet. His day would begin before dawn, checking his vessel for damage from the previous day's journey, loading cargo or passengers, and preparing for the complex navigation required to travel safely along a river that was simultaneously their lifeline and one of their greatest dangers. Navigation on the great river required intimate knowledge of seasonal changes in water levels, shifting sandbars, dangerous currents, and the locations of the hippos and crocodiles that pose constant threats to river traffic. Kamtir's daily routine involved not just the physical work of sailing, rowing, or pulling his craft, but also the mental challenge of reading the river conditions and making split-second decisions. That could mean the difference between a successful journey and a catastrophic accident. The cargo these boatmen transported reveals the incredible diversity of goods that flowed through society on a daily basis. A single boat might carry grain from Upper Kemet, gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, incense from the Red Sea coast, and manufactured goods from workshops in Memphis or Thebes. Kempter had to understand the specific handling requirements for each type of cargo, manage the complex logistics of multiple stops along his route, and maintain detailed records of what was loaded and unloaded at each destination. His memory had become legendary among river workers. He could remember not just where each item belonged, but also the preferences of regular customers and the seasonal patterns that affected demand for different goods. But the Great River wasn't just a commercial highway. It was also the primary means of personal transportation for most people. This meant that boatmen also served as passenger carriers, connecting families separated by distance, enabling pilgrimages to important religious sites, and facilitating the social interactions that bound communities together. On any given day, Kempter might carry a merchant traveling to distant markets, a priest journeying to conduct ceremonies at another temple, a farmer visiting relatives in a neighboring village, or a young woman traveling to her wedding in a distant town. Each passenger brought their own stories, their own needs, and their own contributions to the complex social fabric that held their civilization together. Chapter 9. The Evening Hours. The daily social life of ancient people in Kemet was far richer and more complex than most people realize. After the working day ended, communities came alive with activities that served both entertainment and important social functions. Evening gatherings were central to social life, and they took many different forms depending on the season, the community, and the social class of the participants. In farming villages, people might gather in courtyards or on rooftops to share the day's events, tell stories, play games, and enjoy whatever entertainment was available. Music was an integral part of these gatherings, and it reveals fascinating details about their values in daily life. Musicians used instruments like harps, flutes, drums, and sistrums to create music that accompanied singing, dancing, and storytelling. But this wasn't just casual entertainment. Music was believed to have spiritual power, and many of the songs that filled evenings were actually religious hymns or magical incantations designed to provide protection, ensure good fortune, or honor the gods. Nebaman, a skilled harpist, would spend his evenings moving from house to house in his village, his instrument creating melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of life along the great river. His music could tell the story of the flood, the joy of harvest, the sadness of parting, or the excitement of festival days. Children would gather around him, learning not just the melodies, but also the ancient stories and values embedded in the songs. Dancing was equally important, and served multiple functions in society. Some dances were purely recreational, allowing people to celebrate, court potential partners, or simply enjoy physical expression after long days of labor. Others were religious rituals that were believed to communicate with deities, ensure successful harvests, or protect communities from harm. Heqet, a talented dancer, had learned her art from her grandmother Ankhisnaman, and now she taught the young women of her village. Her movements told stories as clearly as words: the swaying of grain in the wind, the flight of birds, the changing seasons, the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth. Games were another crucial element of social life, and the variety of games they played reveals a society that valued both intellectual challenge and pure fun. Senet, perhaps the most famous board game, was played by people of all social classes and was believed to have religious significance related to the journey through the afterlife, but they also played simpler games that children could enjoy, as well as more complex strategy games that challenged adult players. Amenhotep, a young man of 16, had become renowned throughout his district for his skill at Senet, his ability to think several moves ahead earning him the nickname Farseer. These evening social activities weren't just entertainment. They were essential mechanisms for maintaining community cohesion, transmitting cultural knowledge from one generation to the next, and providing the social bonds that help people cope with the challenges of daily life in a demanding environment. Chapter 10. The Learning Circle. But perhaps most importantly, these gatherings provided opportunities for the kind of informal education that was crucial for most people in Kemet. Children learned about their culture, their history, and their place in society not through formal schooling, which was available only to a small elite, but through the stories, songs, and conversations that filled their evening hours. Keti, an elderly farmer, had become the unofficial storyteller for his village. Each evening, as families gathered to share their meals and rest from their labors, he would begin his tales. Some were ancient stories of gods and heroes, passed down through countless generations. Others were more recent histories of local events, family genealogies, or tales of distant places learned from traveling merchants. Through these stories, young Seneb learned about Pata, the creator god who spoke the world into existence, about Isis, the great mother who brought her husband back from death, about the pharaohs who had built the great monuments, and about the proper way to treat neighbors, parents, and strangers. The seasonal nature of life in Kemet meant that these social patterns changed throughout the year in ways that created a rich and varied community calendar. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, communities had more time for elaborate celebrations, extended storytelling sessions, and the kind of intensive social interaction that strengthened relationships. and resolved conflicts. Harvest time brought different kinds of gatherings, often focused on cooperative work that required community coordination. These weren't just economic activities. They were social events that combined necessary labor with celebration, competition, and the reinforcement of social bonds that would carry communities through the challenges of the coming year. Religious festivals provided another crucial structure for social life, creating occasions when entire communities would come together for celebrations that could last for days. These festivals weren't solemn religious observances in the way we might imagine. They were joyous community celebrations that combined religious devotion with feasting, music, dancing, and a kind of social interaction that was essential for maintaining the complex relationships that held society together. Chapter 11. The Festival of Upeth. Daily preparation for these festivals reveals another important aspect of life in Kemet: the incredible amount of planning and coordination required to make their society function. Organizing a major religious festival required months of preparation, involving craftsmen who created decorations and ceremonial objects, farmers who provided extra food, musicians and dancers who prepared special performances, and religious officials who ensured that all the ceremonial requirements were properly met. During the great festival of Opet, when the god Amun journeyed from his temple at Karnak to his southern sanctuary at Luxor, the entire city of Thebes would transform. Kamwaset, now a successful merchant, would spend weeks preparing for the festival, arranging for extra supplies, coordinating with other merchants to ensure adequate food and drink for the thousands of pilgrims who would attend, and preparing special goods that would commemorate the occasion. His daughter, Nefertari, had been chosen to dance in the procession, and for months she had practiced the sacred dances under the guidance of the temple priestesses. Her movements would help carry the god's spirit from one temple to another, a grace and precision a form of prayer in itself. This level of coordination was necessary for almost every aspect of life in Kemet, from the annual flood cycle that required community-wide cooperation to manage irrigation systems to the complex trade relationships that brought goods from across the known world to their markets. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable aspects of ancient daily life: how they managed to create and maintain one of history's longest-lasting civilizations despite facing challenges that would seem insurmountable to modern people. The coordination required wasn't just impressive from an organizational standpoint. It was absolutely essential for survival. Without it, their civilization would have collapsed within generations rather than lasting for over 3,000 years. Chapter 12. The Problem Solvers. And this brings us to perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of daily life in Kemet: the incredible sophistication of their problem-solving abilities. Every single day, ordinary people had to navigate challenges that would stump most modern people. They had to predict weather patterns without meteorology, manage complex agricultural systems without modern tools, maintain public health without understanding germ theory, and coordinate massive construction projects without computers or even written mathematical formulas as we know them. Take something as basic as food storage, which was literally a matter of life and death in a civilization where a failed harvest could mean starvation for thousands of people. Families didn't just throw their grain into containers and hope for the best. They developed elaborate systems involving multiple types of storage, each designed for specific types of food and specific storage durations. Senemat and his wife, Merit, had perfected their storage techniques over decades of experience. They used jars sealed with beeswax and resin for liquids like oil and wine. They created underground storage chambers that maintained consistent temperatures despite the extreme heat above ground. They developed techniques for drying fruits and vegetables that preserved them for months without refrigeration. They even figured out how to store live fish in artificial ponds, creating a kind of ancient aquaculture system that provided fresh protein year-round. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't techniques developed by specialists and then distributed to the masses. These were skills that ordinary families passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, and adapted to local conditions. A farming family in Upper Kemet might have completely different food storage techniques than a merchant family in the Delta, but both systems would be incredibly sophisticated and perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. The daily maintenance of these systems required constant attention and expertise. Women often specialized in food preservation, spending hours each day monitoring fermentation processes, checking stored goods for signs of spoilage, and adjusting storage conditions based on seasonal changes. Ankhesenaman had become legendary in her village for her ability to preserve foods. Other women would bring their most precious supplies to her for advice, and she would examine grain with the expertise of a modern quality control inspector, her experienced hands detecting problems that less skilled workers would miss entirely. This wasn't just domestic work. It was highly skilled technical labor that required deep understanding of chemistry, biology, and engineering principles that these people couldn't name but absolutely understood. Chapter 13. The builders and healers men often focused on the construction and maintenance of storage facilities themselves, which required skills in masonry, waterproofing, ventilation design, and pest control that would impress modern contractors. They had to build structures that could withstand floods, earthquakes, extreme temperature variations, and the constant assault of insects and rodents that threatened stored food supplies. Children learned these skills through daily participation, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence. By the time they reached adulthood, they possessed a level of practical knowledge about food systems that far exceeded what most modern people understand about where their food comes from or how it's preserved. This same pattern of sophisticated problem-solving appears in every aspect of daily life in Kemet. Consider their approach to personal hygiene and healthcare, which was far more advanced than most people realize. People didn't just wash themselves. They had developed complex systems for maintaining cleanliness that addressed both practical and spiritual concerns. Their daily bathing routines involved not just water, but carefully prepared soaps made from animal fats and plant-based alkalis. They used different cleansing agents for different parts of the body, understanding that skin on the face required different treatment than skin on the hands or feet. They had specialized preparations for hair care that protected against the harsh desert environment while maintaining the elaborate hairstyles that were important markers of social status. But beyond basic cleanliness, people maintained daily health practices that reveal sophisticated understanding of preventive medicine. They used various plant-based preparations to protect against common ailments, maintained dietary practices that modern nutritionists would recognize as sound principles, and engaged in physical activities that were designed to maintain strength and flexibility throughout their lives. The daily routine of a family included time for what we might call physical therapy exercises, though they wouldn't have used that term. People regularly stretched, engaged in strength training using their daily work activities, and participated in games and dances that maintained cardiovascular health and muscular coordination. Nebet, who served as a healer in her village, had studied under the priest-physicians at the nearby temple. Her daily routine included tending a garden of medicinal plants, preparing remedies for common ailments, and treating everyone from minor cuts to serious illnesses. Her knowledge included not just which plants could treat which conditions, but also how to combine different treatments for maximum effectiveness. Women often specialized in herbal medicine, maintaining gardens of medicinal plants and preparing remedies that addressed everything from minor cuts and bruises to serious illnesses. Their daily routines included checking and tending these medicinal gardens, preparing and storing various herbal preparations, and maintaining the knowledge systems that allowed them to diagnose and treat health problems within their families and communities. Chapter 14. The holistic approach to sophistication of their medical knowledge was remarkable. They understood the importance of wound cleaning and had developed antiseptic preparations that actually worked. They knew how to set broken bones, treat various skin conditions, and manage pain using plant-based medicines that contained active compounds similar to modern pharmaceuticals. But perhaps most impressively, they understood the connection between mental and physical health in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Their daily routines included activities designed to maintain emotional balance, social connection, and spiritual well-being. Recognizing that these factors were essential for overall health, this holistic approach to daily life extended to their work practices as well. Craftsmen didn't just focus on producing goods. They maintained work environments that supported both productivity and worker well-being. Workshops were designed to maximize natural lighting while minimizing heat exposure. Work schedules balanced intensive activity with adequate rest periods. Social structures within workshops provided support systems that helped workers cope with both professional challenges and personal problems. The daily life of Hemunu, a workshop supervisor, reveals just how complex these considerations could become. He had to coordinate the technical aspects of production, manage relationships between workers of different skill levels, ensure that quality standards were maintained, handle the business relationships with suppliers and customers, and maintain the workshop facilities themselves. But beyond these obvious responsibilities, he also served as a counselor, mediator, and community leader. Workers brought him personal problems that affected their ability to work effectively. He had to balance competing demands from different customers while maintaining fair treatment for his workers. He served as a link between his workshop and the broader community, representing his workers' interests in community decisions and ensuring that his business contributed appropriately to community needs. Chapter 15. The network of connection. This multi-layered approach to leadership was necessary because society in Kemet was incredibly interconnected. A problem in one workshop could affect suppliers, customers, and competitors throughout the community. A skilled supervisor understood these connections and managed his daily activities with awareness of their broader implications. The same complexity appears in the daily lives of religious officials who serve functions that went far beyond what we might expect from modern religious leaders. A typical temple priest's day included not just religious ceremonies, but also administrative duties, educational responsibilities, and community service obligations that made him a central figure in local society. Amenhotep, a priest of Pata and Memphis, began his day before dawn with personal purification rituals that were far more elaborate than those required of ordinary people. He had to maintain higher standards of physical cleanliness, follow stricter dietary restrictions, and engage in daily meditation and prayer practices that prepared him for his various responsibilities. But once these personal preparations were complete, his day became a complex juggling act between different roles. He might spend the early morning conducting religious ceremonies, the late morning teaching children basic literacy and numeracy, the afternoon mediating disputes between community members, and the evening managing temple finances and coordinating with other religious officials. The educational role was particularly important because formal schooling was available only to a small elite. For most children in Kemet, local priests provided their only access to literacy, basic mathematics, and the kind of general knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in their society. This educational process wasn't just about transferring information. It was about maintaining cultural continuity across generations. Through daily interactions with children and their families, priests ensured that values, traditions, and practical knowledge systems were preserved and adapted to changing circumstances. Young Cain Waset, son of a potter, would spend his mornings at the temple, learning his letters under Amenhotep's patient guidance. The priest taught him not just how to read and write, but also how to calculate areas and volumes, how to understand the calendar and predict the floods, and how to conduct himself properly in various social situations. The daily teaching routine involved not just formal lessons, but also informal mentoring that helped young people understand their place in society and develop the skills they would need as adults. Amenhotep might spend part of his day teaching a future scribe how to prepare papyrus, part of his day helping a young craftsman understand the religious significance of his work, and part of his day counseling parents about how to guide their children's development. Chapter 16. The Sacred Systems. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of a priest's daily life was his role in maintaining the complex religious systems that provided the spiritual foundation for their civilization. This wasn't just a matter of conducting ceremonies. It required deep understanding of theological principles, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and the kind of organizational skills needed to coordinate religious activities across multiple temples and communities. The daily maintenance of these religious systems reveals just how sophisticated their civilization had become. Priests had to track multiple calendar systems simultaneously, coordinate their activities with agricultural cycles and political events, maintain accurate records of religious obligations and ceremonial requirements, and ensure that religious practices remain consistent across vast distances and long periods of time. This level of coordination was possible only because society had developed incredibly effective communication systems that allowed information to flow rapidly across the entire kingdom. The daily life of Seneb, a royal messenger, provides insight into how these communication networks actually functioned. Seneb's day began with careful preparation that was essential for both personal safety and message security. He had to plan his route based on current conditions along the Great River, seasonal variations in travel conditions, and political circumstances that might affect his safety in different regions. The physical demands of his work were enormous. Depending on the urgency of his message and the distance he had to travel, he might spend days traveling by boat, on foot, or using donkeys or other pack animals. He had to navigate not just geographical challenges, but also the complex social and political relationships that determined how he would be received in different communities. But beyond the physical challenges, messengers carried enormous responsibility for maintaining the information systems that held their civilization together. They transported not just official government communications, but also personal letters, business documents, religious instructions, and the kind of informal information that allowed widely separated communities to coordinate their activities. The daily routine of preparing, protecting, and delivering these messages required skills that combined physical endurance with intellectual sophistication. Messengers had to be able to read and write, understand the political implications of the information they carried, maintain absolute discretion about sensitive communications, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances that might require them to alter their plans or find alternative routes. Their work also required deep cultural knowledge that allowed them to function effectively in communities with different customs, dialects, and social structures. Seneb, traveling from Memphis to Aswan, would encounter dozens of different local communities, each with its own particular characteristics, and he had to understand how to approach local leaders, follow appropriate social protocols, and avoid misunderstandings that could delay his mission or even put him in danger. Chapter 17. The Regional Tapestry. This cultural sophistication was necessary because civilization in Kemet wasn't as uniform as we might imagine. While there were certainly shared values, religious beliefs, and social structures that unified the kingdom, There were also significant regional variations that reflected different environmental conditions, economic specializations, and historical experiences. The daily life of people in the Delta region was shaped by different challenges and opportunities than those faced by people in Upper Kemet or Nubia. Coastal communities had access to Mediterranean trade networks but had to deal with different security threats. Desert oasis communities had developed specialized techniques for managing scarce water resources but had limited access to some goods that river communities took for granted. These regional differences created opportunities for specialization and trade that enriched their civilization, but they also required sophisticated coordination, systems that could manage the complexity without losing the benefits of diversity. The daily routines of local administrators reveal how this coordination actually worked at the practical level. Reckmeyer, a provincial governor, spent his days balancing local needs with national requirements, managing relationships between different communities within his jurisdiction, coordinating with other governors to address regional challenges, and maintaining communication with the royal court that kept central authorities informed about local conditions. His responsibilities included everything from tax collection and legal dispute resolution to infrastructure, maintenance, and military recruitment. But perhaps most importantly, he served as a cultural bridge between local communities and the broader civilization, ensuring that regional variations remained within acceptable bounds while allowing communities to adapt institutions to their particular circumstances. This balancing act required enormous skill and constant attention to changing conditions. Reckmeyer had to understand not just the formal requirements of his position, but also the informal relationships and cultural dynamics that actually determined how effectively he could accomplish his goals. His daily routine included formal meetings with local officials, informal conversations with community leaders, personal interactions with ordinary citizens who brought him their concerns and complaints, and private time for planning and reflection that allowed him to stay ahead of developing problems. Chapter 18. The web of relationships. But beyond these obvious duties, he also had to maintain his own household, manage his personal relationships with family and friends, and participate in the social and religious activities that were essential for maintaining his standing in the community. The daily life of a high-ranking official wasn't just about exercising power. It was about maintaining the complex web of relationships that made effective governance possible. This same pattern appears throughout society in Kemet. Whether we're looking at farmers, craftsmen, merchants, priests, or government officials, their daily lives involved far more complexity and sophistication than we might expect from people living thousands of years ago. They had developed social institutions, economic systems, and cultural practices that allowed them to create and maintain one of history's most successful civilizations. They solved problems that would challenge modern societies, adapted to environmental conditions that would defeat less organized communities, and maintained cultural continuity across centuries of change and challenge. And they did all of this while dealing with the same basic human needs and desires that we face today: the need for food, shelter, and security, a desire for meaningful work and social connection, the challenge of raising children and caring for aging parents, and the universal human quest for purpose and meaning in daily life. The daily routines we've explored reveal people who were remarkably similar to us in their fundamental humanity, but who had developed very different solutions to the challenges of creating successful, sustainable communities. Their approaches offer insights that remain relevant today, reminding us that there are many different ways to organize human society and many different definitions of what constitutes a good life. Chapter 19. The Evening Sanctuary. Evening hours in ancient Kemet reveal perhaps the most intimate and fascinating aspects of daily life. When the crushing heat finally subsided and communities came alive with activities that would surprise anyone who thinks these people lived simple, primitive lives. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, families didn't just collapse from exhaustion after their demanding days. Instead, they participated in a rich social world that was both deeply practical and surprisingly sophisticated. Picture a typical evening in a middle-class neighborhood along the Great River around 2,500 years before our Common Era. As the temperature finally dropped to bearable levels, courtyards and rooftops throughout the community began filling with people engaging in activities that served multiple purposes simultaneously. This wasn't just leisure time. It was when the real business of maintaining social relationships, educating children, and preserving cultural knowledge actually took place. Food preparation for the evening meal was a community affair that reveals incredible details about social structures and values. Unlike our modern world where families eat in isolation, evening meals were often shared events that involved multiple households, extended family members, and even neighbors who contributed different elements to create elaborate communal feasts. The process of preparing these evening meals required coordination that would impress modern event planners. Different families specialized in different aspects of meal preparation, not just because of resource limitations, but because this specialization created social bonds that strengthened community resilience. Nefertiti's family might be known for their exceptional bread baking, while Amenhotep's household excelled with vegetables, and Kamweset's family had mastered the art of preparing meat in ways that maximized both flavor and preservation. Women often took the lead in coordinating these meal preparations, but this leadership role extended far beyond simple cooking. They managed complex social negotiations about who would contribute what, how resources would be shared, and how the resulting feast would be distributed among participants. These negotiations required diplomatic skills that would be impressive in any context, because they had to balance practical considerations with social relationships, economic realities with cultural expectations. Chapter 20. The Art of Nourishment. The actual cooking process was a technological marvel that most people completely underestimate. Cooks didn't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best. They had developed sophisticated techniques for controlling heat, managing cooking times, and combining flavors that created dishes far more complex than the simple bread and beer diet that most people associate with ancient Kemet. Their ovens were engineering marvels designed to maintain consistent temperatures despite limited fuel supplies and extreme environmental conditions. They understood fermentation processes that created not just bread and beer, but also cheeses, preserved vegetables, and fermented sauces that added variety and nutrition to their diets. They had developed spice blending techniques that use locally available herbs and imported aromatics to create flavor profiles that were both delicious and medically beneficial. But perhaps most remarkably, they understood food safety principles that protected them from foodborne illnesses that could devastate communities without modern medical care. Merit, who had become renowned for her cooking throughout her district, knew exactly which combinations of ingredients provided natural preservation, which cooking techniques eliminated dangerous bacteria, and which storage methods prevented spoilage in hot, humid conditions. The evening meal itself was a carefully orchestrated social event that served functions far beyond simple nutrition. The way people were seated reflected social hierarchies, but also provided opportunities for mentoring relationships between older and younger community members. The order in which different dishes were served created natural conversation rhythms that allowed for the sharing of information, the resolution of conflicts, and the maintenance of social bonds that held communities together. Children weren't just passive recipients of food during these evening gatherings. They were active participants in elaborate educational processes that transmitted everything from practical skills to cultural values. While adults were eating and talking, children were learning about food preparation, social etiquette, economic relationships, and the complex web of obligations and opportunities that would shape their adult lives. Young Amenemop, now 12 years old, had learned to read the subtle social cues that indicated when it was appropriate to speak, when to listen, and when to help serve others. He was absorbing lessons about hospitality, generosity, and community responsibility that would guide his behavior throughout his life. Chapter 21. The Power of Story. The stories told during these evening meals weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated information management systems that preserved historical knowledge, technical expertise, and cultural wisdom in ways that made them memorable and personally meaningful. A story about Jehuti, a clever farmer who outwitted a dishonest merchant, wasn't just amusing. It taught practical lessons about commercial relationships, negotiation strategies, and ethical principles that listeners could apply in their own lives. Religious stories served similar educational functions, but they also provided emotional and psychological support that helped people cope with the challenges and uncertainties of daily life. Stories about gods overcoming obstacles, heroes persevering through difficulties, and communities surviving disasters provided both practical guidance and emotional reassurance that strengthened individual resilience and community solidarity. Ketty, the village storyteller, had inherited hundreds of these tales from his grandmother Nebbit, and he was already teaching them to his own grandson Horace. Each story had multiple layers of meaning: entertainment for the children, practical wisdom for the adults, and spiritual guidance for those seeking deeper understanding. Music during these evening gatherings reveals another layer of sophistication that most people never consider. Musicians weren't just playing random tunes to provide background entertainment. They were performing complex compositions that served multiple functions simultaneously, creating emotional atmospheres that enhanced social bonding while also transmitting cultural information and providing opportunities for individual expression. The instruments themselves were technological marvels that required sophisticated understanding of acoustics, material science, and manufacturing techniques. Harps had to be constructed with precise tension, systems that maintained proper tuning, despite extreme temperature variations. Drums required carefully prepared animal skins that produced specific tonal qualities while withstanding constant use. Flutes and other wind instruments demanded precise measurements and finishing techniques that created accurate pitch relationships and pleasing timbres. Kamwaset, a skilled harp maker, could spend months crafting a single instrument, his practiced hands shaping wood and testing tensions until the harp produced exactly the right resonance and tone quality that would make it worthy of ceremonial use. Chapter 22. Movement as language. But beyond the technical aspects, music served psychological and social functions that were essential for community well-being. Different types of music were used to create specific emotional states that served therapeutic purposes, helping people process grief, celebrate achievements, manage anxiety, and maintain the emotional balance necessary for effective functioning in challenging environments. The dancing that accompanied this music wasn't just physical entertainment. It was a complex communication system that allowed for the expression of ideas and emotions that were difficult to convey through words alone. Different dance forms served different social functions, from courtship rituals that helped young people form appropriate partnerships to religious ceremonies that maintained spiritual connections to competitive displays that established social hierarchies without resorting to violence. Hequet, now recognized as the finest dancer in her region, had developed a vocabulary of movement that could tell entire stories through gesture and rhythm. Her dances could depict the changing seasons, the great flood, the journey of the sun across the sky, or the eternal struggle between order and chaos that lay at the heart of their worldview. Children learned these dance forms through daily participation, gradually mastering not just the physical movements, but also the cultural meanings and social contexts that made dancing an effective tool for community building and personal expression. By adulthood, most people possessed a vocabulary of physical movement that allowed them to participate in complex social interactions that strengthened community bonds while providing outlets for individual creativity. Games played during these evening hours reveal another dimension of sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient life. These weren't just simple diversions to pass time. They were educational tools that taught everything from mathematical concepts to strategic thinking, from social skills to ethical principles. Board games like Senet weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated simulations that helped players understand complex concepts about probability, planning, and decision-making under uncertainty. The religious symbolism embedded in these games provided opportunities for discussing spiritual concepts in ways that were both intellectually engaging and emotionally meaningful. Amenhotep, who had become a master of Senet, could read the board positions like a priest reading sacred texts, seeing in the movement of pieces the eternal dance between fate and free will that govern both games and life. Chapter 23. The Making of Things Physical. Games and competitions served similar educational functions while also providing the exercise and skill development that were essential for survival in a physically demanding environment. Wrestling matches, running competitions, and various ball games weren't just fun. They were training systems that maintained the physical fitness and competitive skills that individuals needed to succeed in their daily work and contribute effectively to community defense. But perhaps most importantly, these games provided opportunities for social interaction across age groups and social classes in ways that strengthened community cohesion while allowing for the peaceful resolution of tensions and conflicts that might otherwise disrupt social harmony. The evening hours also provided time for the maintenance and creation of the material objects that made daily life possible. This wasn't just busy work to fill idle time. It was essential economic activity that required sophisticated skills and careful coordination between different community members. Women often spent evening hours engaged in textile production that was far more complex than simple weaving. They had to process raw materials like flax and wool using techniques that required deep understanding of fiber properties, chemical treatments, and mechanical processes. They operated looms that were engineering marvels capable of producing fabrics with complex patterns, varying textures, and specific performance characteristics suited for different purposes. The designs they created weren't just decorative. They were information systems that communicated social status, regional identity, religious beliefs, and personal achievements in ways that were immediately recognizable to other community members. Ankheisneman, a master weaver, could look at someone's clothing and immediately understand their occupation, their family background, their economic status, and their role in the community's social structure. Our own creations were sought after throughout the region, not just for their beauty, but for the stories they told and the status they conveyed. Men often used evening hours for tool maintenance and creation that was equally sophisticated and equally essential for community survival. They had to maintain metal tools using techniques that required understanding of metallurgy, heat treatment, and precision shaping that would impress modern craftsmen. They created wooden implements using carpentry skills that combined artistic sensibility with functional excellence and durability requirements. But beyond these obvious practical activities, evening hours provided time for the kind of innovation and experimentation that allowed technology and culture to evolve and improve over time. Chapter 24. The Circle of Learning Craftsmen used their leisure time to experiment with new techniques, test different materials, and develop improved tools and methods that enhanced productivity and quality in their daily work. These innovations weren't just individual achievements. They were community resources that were shared through informal networks that connected craftsmen across different specialties and different regions. Sentiment, a carpenter who had developed an improved joint technique, would share that knowledge with other woodworkers who would adapt and refine it further, creating a continuous improvement process that strengthened the entire technological base of their civilization. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of personal relationships and individual development that were essential for psychological well-being and social stability. Courtship rituals weren't just romantic diversions. They were complex social processes that helped young people form partnerships that would contribute to community strength and individual happiness. These courtship processes involved elaborate systems of gift exchange, artistic performance, and social interaction that allowed potential partners to demonstrate their skills, values, and compatibility in ways that helped ensure successful long-term relationships. Parents and community elders played important roles in these processes, not as controlling authorities, but as advisors and facilitators who helped young people navigate the complex social and economic considerations that affected partnership decisions. Nefertiti, now of marriageable age, was participating in the evening gatherings with new awareness of their social dimensions. She observed how the young men demonstrated their skills and character through their contributions to community activities, and she was learning to express her own capabilities and interests in ways that would attract a suitable partner. Marriage arrangements weren't just personal choices. They were economic alliances that affected the prosperity and stability of extended families and entire communities. The evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of extended discussion and negotiation that allowed these arrangements to develop in ways that balanced individual desires with community needs. Chapter 25. The Inner Journey. But even beyond courtship and marriage, the evening hours provided opportunities for the kind of personal growth and individual expression that were essential for human flourishing. People used this time for artistic pursuits, intellectual development, and spiritual practices that enriched their lives while also contributing to the cultural wealth of their communities. The artistic activities weren't just hobbies. They were sophisticated creative practices that required years of training and constant refinement. Painters, sculptors, and other visual artists used evening hours to develop techniques, experiment with materials, and create works that serve both aesthetic and functional purposes in their communities. Musicians and poets used this time to compose new works, refine their performance skills, and explore creative possibilities that pushed the boundaries of their artistic traditions while remaining connected to the cultural values that gave their work meaning and social relevance. But, perhaps most importantly, the evening hours provided time for the kind of reflection and contemplation that allowed individuals to process their experiences, understand their place in the larger community, and develop the wisdom and perspective that made them effective contributors to collective. While this personal development wasn't just individual self-improvement. It was community investment that strengthened the human resources available for addressing collective challenges and pursuing shared goals. Communities recognized that individual growth contributed to collective prosperity, and they structured their social systems to support and encourage personal development in ways that benefited everyone. Amenhotep, now an elder in his community, would spend his evening hours in quiet reflection, reviewing the day's events, contemplating the larger patterns of life and change, and preparing his mind and spirit for whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow might bring. The seasonal variations in evening activities reveal another layer of sophistication in social organization. Different times of year brought different opportunities and challenges that required adaptive responses from individuals and communities. During the flood season, when outdoor work was limited, evening hours might be extended into elaborate festivals and celebrations that could last for days. These weren't just parties. They were community-building exercises that strengthened social bonds, resolved accumulated tensions, and provided opportunities for the kind of intensive cultural transmission that preserved traditional knowledge while allowing for innovation and adaptation. Chapter 26. The eternal cycle during planting and harvest seasons. When daytime work was intensive and urgent, evening activities might be more focused on rest and recovery, but they still included the essential social and cultural functions that maintained community, cohesion, and individual well-being. Ability to adapt these social patterns to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential functions demonstrates a level of cultural sophistication that allowed their civilization to persist through centuries of environmental, political, and economic changes that destroyed less adaptable societies. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of evening life was how it balanced individual needs with collective requirements in ways that created sustainable communities that could thrive over long periods of time. The social structures that emerged during these evening hours weren't imposed from above by authorities. They developed organically, through the daily interactions of people who understood that their individual well-being depended on the health and prosperity of their communities. This understanding created social systems that were both flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and stable enough to provide the predictability and security that allowed individuals to plan for the future and invest in long-term relationships and projects. The evening hours also provided opportunities for the kind of inter-community interaction that connected local communities to the broader civilization and to external trade networks that brought goods, ideas, and people from across the known world. Traveling merchants, visiting craftsmen, religious pilgrims, and government officials often participated in these evening social activities, bringing news, ideas, and perspectives from other regions that enriched local communities while also connecting them to larger networks of information and opportunity. These interactions weren't just casual social exchanges. They were essential components of the communication systems that allowed their civilization to maintain coherence across vast distances and diverse environmental conditions. The information that flowed through these informal networks complemented the formal communication systems maintained by government and religious authorities, creating redundant information pathways that ensured that important knowledge reached all parts of society. As we reach the conclusion of our gentle journey through daily life in ancient Kemet, we begin to understand that these weren't just people who happened to live a long time ago. They were sophisticated human beings who had developed solutions to fundamental challenges of human organization that remain relevant today. Their evening routines reveal people who understood that human well-being required more than just adequate food and shelter. It required meaningful social relationships, opportunities for personal growth, creative expression, and participation in something larger than individual survival. Epilogue, the eternal dawn. And so, as another evening draws to a close in ancient Kemet, and as our gentle story comes to its end, we see families beginning their transition towards sleep. Their days filled with work and community, learning and growth, challenge and accomplishment. The stars emerging in the clear desert sky remind us that human life is part of a larger pattern, an eternal cycle of work and rest, growth and harvest, individual effort and collective achievement. Tomorrow will bring another dawn, another day of working together to build and maintain the complex, beautiful civilization they have created along the life-giving waters of their great river. Another day of solving problems, caring for each other, and participating in the endless human adventure of creating meaning and beauty in a challenging world. Their sophisticated approaches to organizing human communities, their deep understanding of the connections between individual and collective well-being, and their remarkable ability to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to change offer insights that remain relevant for all of us seeking to create lives and communities that support both personal fulfillment and collective flourishing. As you settle into your own rest, perhaps you can carry with you some sense of the gentle rhythms, the careful attention to detail, and the deep understanding of human needs that made daily life in ancient Kemet not just a matter of survival, but a rich tapestry of meaning, connection, and quiet satisfaction. Sleep well, knowing that across the centuries, other people have faced the challenges of daily life with wisdom, creativity, and an understanding that individual well-being and community prosperity are inseparably connected. The ancient people of Kemet understood that each day was an opportunity to contribute to something larger than themselves, while also finding personal meaning and satisfaction in the daily routines of work, family, and community life. May their example inspire in your own days a similar balance of individual growth and collective contribution, of practical effectiveness and spiritual meaning, of hard work and gentle rest. Sweet dreams.